No one has ever made an impact by standing on the sidelines, whimpering, complaining, or protesting without taking action. We make progress by implementing our ideas. Pharmacists must take action. This is PolitiTalkRx, the highly charged, sometimes controversial, political internet radio talk show dedicated to the profession of pharmacy. The policies that shape our healthcare system are complex, and pharmacists, pharmacy professionals, and industry stakeholders must have a seat at the table to participate in conversations, discussions, and debates, which lead to actions that drive change supporting the profession of pharmacy. This podcast is intended to shake up the status quo and promote change to promote the profession of pharmacy while advocating for better patient care delivered by pharmacists. PolitiTalkRx is part of the U.S. healthcare system's largest and most influential network of podcasts dedicated to our profession, the Pharmacy Podcast Network.
All right, well, we're here on another show for PolitiTalkRx on the Pharmacy Podcast Network, and I have the honor of being with Associate Director, Health Economics and Outcomes Research, Dr. Edward Lee. Like I said, it's a huge honor to have you. I know that it's been in the talks for a while now about having you come down and do this, and we appreciate it. I know tomorrow we have Sandoz Day here at NSU College of Pharmacy, so thank you very much for coming today.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
So let's talk a little bit about your background. I know you're PharmD and PH. You have your BCOP. You specialize in oncology, pharmacoeconomics, and pharmacoepidemiology.
Right.
But I was more interested in your actual background. So those are all titles and all the good stuff, but I want to know a little bit. You graduating pharmacy school, I know you had said that you went into residency, so tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is I'm a second-generation pharmacist, if you go all the way back, and both my parents are pharmacists, and so that's what I knew I wanted to do for the rest of my life, was go into pharmacy. And my parents had a store when I was in pharmacy school, but halfway through my pharmacy education, they decided to sell it. So I needed to figure out something else to do.
You were relying on that, huh?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And clinical was becoming more and more important, and people were saying that pharmacists were going to take on these more clinical roles. So I really took to doing the residency training. And before they called it a PGY1 and PGY2, I did the first year as a general pharmacy practice residency, and then followed that up with an oncology pharmacy practice residency. And I really took to the oncology space because I thought the drugs were very, very interesting, and I knew that this was going to be an area that was going to be booming in the future. So I did the residency thing.
By the way, it's one of those, because I worked in oncology as well, and I told you about that. It's one of those areas that you're like, I really wanted to do successful, but no, do I really want it to be successful? Because that means that there's a lot more patients out there, which is not good. Right. So it's one of those like hard things to talk about. We'd always be like, man, we're doing well.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry about that.
Absolutely. No, and if you look at kind of the numbers that were just released, we've made significant progress in terms of, we as a society have made significant progress in treating cancer and extending the life of cancer patients in the United States. So incredible achievement on society's part. And so in terms of kind of my first job out of residency is I was a good tutor in college. So I figured, hey, why not go into academia? Started off teaching at Wilkes University School of Pharmacy. And then I had a brief hiatus with the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. And that's where I started to learn about outcomes research and pharmacoeconomics and all of these other different aspects of healthcare in general, such as health policy. So when I decided it was time for me to go back into academia, I went back at the University of New England, but decided to get my Master in Public Health at the same time. So that's really where I started to develop kind of that expertise in pharmacoepidemiology, pharmacoeconomics, health policy, and all those sorts of things. And for the last few years, when I was in academia, I had done a lot of manuscripts, publications, talks on health policies and pharmacoeconomic studies, and a lot of what I did focused on specifically biosimilars.
And I don't think a lot of people, when they're in pharmacy school, naturally think economics.
Right.
You know, it's a very simplistic entry point that we take prior to, and then you take some pharmacoeconomic research and outcome stuff, but it's not like what you're doing.
Right.
So I think it's amazing. I know that our discussion, I wish we could have recorded that alone. It would have been a blessing. But I mean, I want, first of all, before we get any further, please, just out of due diligence, can you please give your disclaimer before we go into any questions regarding some other things?
Absolutely. And thanks for having me today. I just want your audience to know that I'm here on behalf of myself, and these, what I'm going to be talking about today are my own opinions and do not necessarily reflect those of Sandoz.
Perfect. Now that we got that out of the way, I want to start with, just again for the purpose of our audience, an all-inclusive audience we have, and I want to start from the skeleton point, if you could think of it that way. Can you explain biosimilars history a bit, and what they mean when we're discussing them versus brand versus generic? Because I don't think people clearly understand what a biosimilar is.
Sure, absolutely. And in order to do this, let's go way back at the very beginning when we first had generics available. And so we know that when a new drug gets approved, it goes through a regulatory process that the FDA says, okay, this drug is safe and effective. And then sometime in the 80s, there was a law passed, the Hatch-Waxman Law. And what it allowed for was generic companies now come in and produce that same drug for drugs that have gone off patent, right? And so what it did was it created this pathway to say, we're going to use now the safety and efficacy data of the reference product, and this generic now, all it has to do is prove that it's chemically identical to the reference product and also bioequivalent. And so in pharmacy school, right, we learned about bioequivalence and all the data that's necessary to generate that, right? The 90% confidence interval needs to be between 80 to 125%, right, for the CMAX and AUC, right? So we learned about that in pharmacy school, and that's kind of part of the approval process. Now, the problem is, as we start to develop in terms of our technologies, instead of just having chemical entities and chemical drugs, we started to have biologics approved. And these biological agents have impacted care and outcomes for all sorts of different patients, not just oncology patients, but we're talking about rheumatology and diabetes, all these different areas. And so now these products were coming off patent. These biologics were coming off patent. But there wasn't a pathway to allow other manufacturers to come in and manufacture those same biologics and leverage the safety and efficacy data that's already been generated by the reference product. Right. So that's what the new law allows for in the biosimilar pathway, is this analogous pathway to a generic, except it's a pathway for biologics to have another manufacturer come in and produce that particular biological medicine and leverage the safety and efficacy data of the reference product, and the biosimilar manufacturer then has to demonstrate then that it's highly similar to the reference product with no clinically meaningful differences. And
I know that, and I'm getting off a little topic here maybe, but in terms of the variances, I know that was one of the questions that I hear a lot of people talk about. I don't think people recognize that drug manufacturer to manufacturer has variances from the original, what should be. And I think when they think right away biosimilars, the first thing they say is, well, there's so many variances. Oh, it's going to be completely different. And, you get that when you get a normal patient that says, I want the brand, versus the generic.
Yeah, and that goes back to the term I used earlier, the highly similar term, right? And so for chemical entities, you can show that it's identical. But for any biological product, you have to remember that if we were to shrink ourselves down to the microscopic level and look inside that vial, it's a heterogeneous molecular population that's being administered to the patient. And so there is no identicality standard, because it is impossible then, because it's a heterogeneous population, to be identical from batch to batch, lot to lot over time, right? And so that's why the term highly similar was actually selected. And really what this does is it recognizes the heterogeneity of biological products itself. And so reference biologics will drift in time in terms of specific quality, what we call quality attributes. And a lot of these are not clinically meaningful at all.
Right. Okay, so we discussed a little bit about the laws and the aspect of that. I think taking a step back, let's look at where some of what we hear in the media, some of what we hear around healthcare, the ACA, right? The Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare.
Right.
We hear a lot about getting rid of it. We hear a lot about all of these things. So taking a step back, 50,000-foot view, when we talk about the ACA, what has it done? What has it done for biosimilars?
Right. The biosimilar law, so the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act, that was integrated fully within the Affordable Care Act. So if we had a wholesale repeal of the Affordable Care Act, that would essentially go away. And we have to remember that with the BPCI, again, it's set up this pathway for approval for biosimilar medications. And what this pathway does, again, is allows other manufacturers to leverage the reference product's safety and efficacy data, so that the registration, the phase 3 registration trials that demonstrate safety and efficacy don't have to be reproduced. Right. And so that's where most of the development costs come from developing a new medication, is within those prospective randomized phase 3 trials that we look at and evaluate on journal clubs, right? And so if we don't have this pathway, how can we get lower cost biosimilars on the market, and how will they be able to compete on price? It wouldn't be able to happen. So when people talk about getting rid of it, we have to remember that's going to really stifle competition in the marketplace if we do that. So I think what people have been talking about with ACA repeals has really been mostly around like the individual mandate and certain things. And so
the fines.
Yeah, exactly. So like certain aspects of it. And I think what most people realize is that the BPCI has done a lot of good, and that should stay intact. So, I hope
whatever plan comes, that has to stay.
That has to stay.
Among other things that have come from it. But absolutely, I think that's just, I want to make sure that I guess I'm right. your cheerleader over here. Yeah. When it comes to the BPCI, a number of years ago, many organizations were making projections of how the U.S. health system could save with biosimilars. So, right. I think that's the big thing for me is as a public health provider, I'm looking to try to find real ways of savings and real savings in terms of patient care. I think a lot of people don't realize the direct medical costs, and then there's a lot of other things associated. And by the time it gets to that patient's bill, we're taking everything into consideration. Yep. So transparency, this is such a transparent mark of $54 billion that's saved. That's huge, and how that can impact the healthcare system is phenomenal. Right, absolutely. So I wanted to get a little bit more into, I know Sandoz was a pioneer here in the United States. When it comes to biosimilars, what does the future for us, include?
Yeah, I think the future is going to be exciting because we will have more and more biologics coming off patent and exclusivity, and so more of these, the newer biologics, so to speak, will have biosimilars available. And what this does is that it'll free up some space and relieve some pressure off of the budgets to allow for the newer next generation medications to be available for patients. And there's this huge excitement around immunotherapy, right? And using that and for the active treatment of cancer. And so these are not cheap therapies. And so we have to be aware of the fact that as we keep progressing along with new and more novel therapies, perhaps, there needs to be some relief coming from somewhere else to do that. So I think really the biggest excitement to me about biosimilars is how it could allow for this room for the newer therapies to come along. And so
can you describe some of the therapies currently on the market? I know we talked about oncolytics. Right. Could you describe, just so people have an idea of what kind of drugs biosimilars are? Right. In what genres?
Yeah, absolutely. So really biologics in general, anything that end with a mab, right? So right now we have biosimilar infliximab. There have been a number of biosimilar adalimumab's approved as well. You have what they call decoy receptors. So those are products that and drugs that end with a sept. So things like etanercept would be something down the line as well. Then we also have the agents for the supportive care in cancer. So your myeloid growth factors, your erythropoiesis stimulating agents, those sorts of agents, but also the active treatment of cancer as well. So there's been a number of biosimilars approved for something like trastuzumab, and that would be for the active treatment of cancer too.
So diabetes, gout, I mean, are we talking in those areas on a mass? Are we continuing to move in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. And diabetes would fall into that as well. You know, they're biologics, although historically they have not been regulated as biologics, but it's moving in that direction where the FDA is going to now kind of move them over to the biologic side. So yes, biosimilars would include diabetes products as well. So like your long-acting insulins specifically.
When it comes to biosimilars, we talked about cost and access in Europe, for instance. So what does that experience teach us in that regard?
Yeah, so a number of years ago, or actually for the past couple of years, a company called IQVIA, or formerly known as IMS, they were commissioned by the European Commission, along with some other nonprofit companies, to create a report about biosimilar price, competition, volume, and utilization. And there are a number of learnings that we can get out of that report from Europe. Number one is that European markets are incredibly complex. So no one market and no one member state within the European Union really it serves as a representation of the entire body, number one. But overall, in terms of in aggregate, what they found was that they've seen price reductions in terms of the price per treatment day of these different therapies go down. Wow. And it really differs depending on what type of therapeutic area you're talking about. So it's like some of the more established areas like erythropoiesis stimulating agents and myeloid growth factors, which have been around for a long time, go anywhere between 30 to 39% reductions in terms of price per treatment day, versus newer entrants like oncology agents will be somewhere around 3% or so. But
it's
still
savings.
It's still savings.
I mean, as long as we pharmacists are good at counting numbers and have more of you guys around, we'll be able to show more, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's about the maturity of the market as well. So initially when they
demand and so forth.
Exactly. So over time, we might see those the price per treatment day come down a little bit more. The second part of that story actually is what it's done for access. Yeah. And what they've seen was that the number of treatment days and the volume of use for the total market as a whole has gone up. So a good case of this would be something like infliximab, and you would see pre-biosimilars, you would see growth in infliximab treatment days. But post-infliximab biosimilars coming out, the growth accelerated a lot more. So even more people were being able to get treated on the entire class of medications because of the fact that you had additional choices out and being able to treat people at a lower price point.
Yeah, and for me, again, public health, it's all about the access, and that's really my I guess fame in that regard is I really like to see programs, projects, initiatives, even things like this that can create more access, because we can lower price. If you have no access to it, then who cares?
Right.
My next question for you would be, what kind of challenges do we have and what do we foresee?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges is one that we've been talking about for quite a long time, which is biosimilars education. And I think this is a great kind of shout out to you for having something like this, which is just getting the word out there.
Can I hear you again? Shout out? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. What is a biosimilar? Yeah. What does it entail? What are these and what can they do for our healthcare system and society in general? And so, I think just hearing about biosimilars more and getting familiar with them, getting familiar with the approval process and the and how they're regulated, and the fact that these are high quality products.
And what they can be used for.
Yeah, exactly. What they can be used for. I think puts people at ease in terms of their willingness then to use them. And we want these additional choices out there so that there's more competition and more choice, which leads to better prices, better access for patients. And ultimately, what we're talking about is improved outcomes for the entire population, for society.
Well, and it also leads to personalized therapy, not just a one-size-fits-all or one type or one company and so forth. And I think, with the companies like Sandoz, for instance, we see there's a big brand effect to biosimilars. It's not just somebody trying to jump in the market. Like I said, it's the pioneer in the space. So jumping a little bit into you and because you're very, very, very impressive as an individual, as a professional in the healthcare space. I wanted to talk to you about when it comes to directors of pharmacy, physicians, students, even those interested in investing. What points should we all know? What are some of the points that you would say, if you're getting into this space, what should you know?
Yeah, it's that's a very provocative question and very very high level. And I think I want to back up, and instead of saying there are specific things you need to know right now, I think I want to make it a little bit more high level as well, right? Because I don't purport to know all the answers myself, and I can kind of look down the pipeline and think about there are certain things you need to know. But I think part of it is having the humility that there are things that I don't know right now, and I need to educate myself and read and keep my finger on the pulse of what's coming down the line. Because I think as pharmacists, sometimes we get stuck into the day-to-day, right? We've got a patient that needs our attention, and we've got to do our CEs, and we have our list of to-do things if you're in academia, and you don't ever get to kind of take a step back and say what's really going on, right? And where are things like AI going to take us in the future? And so I think to me the biggest point that I can say is that think far ahead and don't get into the data. Don't just get into the day-to-day and let that be your world. But you have to think what's coming down. What are some of these external threats to our profession that's coming down, and then adjust your strategy for that. So,
do you see biosimilars being in a space? I mean, the concept that I have seen. I don't know if you're familiar with the physician Daniel Kraft. He's a very innovative speaker. He runs Singularity University. Okay. He's spoken about the idea that one day we'll be able to put our finger on a blood strip. It'll take our blood, and then within 30 seconds, our warfarin will be 3D printed in front of us. Right. I mean, do we see that in sense of biosimilars one day? Do you see that do you foresee that? Right. Are you hopeful for that?
Yeah. It's interesting because we don't really have a regulatory process for something like that at this point in time. Back in a few years back, I attended a presentation at ASHP mid-year where somebody from the Department of Defense talked about how they could deploy these modules to the battlefield that could actually, based off of a core amount of raw ingredients, manufacture on the spot various active pharmaceutical ingredients, including biologics as well. So specifically, he was talking about erythropoiesis stimulating agents. Now, he had to make clear that these are not
regulated.
Regulated. They're not what we would consider.
They're just in the military.
Yeah, exactly. But it's for a completely different purpose than interstate commerce, right? So, I think, I think the technology will be available, but the question is, how do we regulate those, and how do they become mass available to the public? I think that's a question that society has to answer.
Well, we know the military usually kind of sets the tone for a lot of healthcare space. I mean, they have surgeons out there that are, in some hospital here in the States, and their arms are being utilized as robots somewhere else.
Absolutely.
I know that you and I spoke about your career and involvement in academia and also oncology and health economics outcomes research, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on the current state of pharmacy. I know that we've done a discussion on where we need to be. You just actually got into that about some of the outside negatives and things that, maybe factors to us. Talk to me a little bit. Where do you see pharmacy? Where do you see it going as well?
Right. Yeah, I think at least when I was in school, my professors made sure to tell me about how the roles of pharmacists were changing from dispensing to clinical, right? And I think for the most part, that's been achieved. And yes, you can talk about, well, we haven't gotten provider status in X number of states and things like that. But if you kind of look at what are pharmacists doing and where do students want to go after pharmacy school, it's all these clinical roles. So even though perhaps some of the state laws need to follow up and catch up to that, right? I think we're predominantly there. So where's really the next sort of wave for pharmacy? Where's the future for that? And it's interesting. I just saw the World Economic Forum is going on, right? And many of the speakers were talking about the concept of upskilling. And I think that's going to apply to pharmacy as well, because I think what's going to happen is we can get into the same, thoughts about being comfortable in just doing the day-to-day clinical. But the problem is that itself is also not, quote unquote, safe.
Sustainable.
And sustainable, right? And especially if we have something like artificial intelligence. So just to give you, if you remember back to your clinical days, right, going on rotations, what you would do is you would spend probably 2 hours in the morning looking at 20 patient charts, but in the end, you would really make an intervention on maybe 2 or 3, right? The sickest ones that actually needed an intervention. But you had to look at 20 charts to know that 2 or 3 needed the intervention. Right. Everybody else was okay.
But AI could do that in 5 minutes. Do that.
Exactly. It could triage the patients for you and send you to the right patients so that you're spending your time focusing on those interventions and not necessarily just reviewing the charts.
Well, I think too many people think that there will not be patients because of technology, which is the backwards way of thinking in my mind, and probably in yours. I think it helps us focus more on the patients that need to be treated rather than the wasted time on those that may not need to be. Right. And I mean, even in consulting, how much charts I would go through and maybe out of 400 charts, give 10 recommendations, and don't quote me on that because I don't want to have the state of Florida come after me. But, the idea is that I think that it's important for us to utilize technology. Now, I get it. Some technologies may end up taking some areas of jobs away, but we need to be more of we need to have more of the understanding that that's going to happen with any industry.
Absolutely.
It's how we create value. I was talking to students yesterday, and somebody was asking about they were in retail, and they asked about how not being paid to work with chronic care management in terms of a CPA, a collaborative practice agreement. But the problem that the solution I see is that MTMs, how many pharmacists used to do that before a payer said, we're going to pay for it? Right. I believe that if we show our value, then people will recognize it because they need that expert like we are. We're experts. We have this niche. So I mean, I'm sure you, again, I know you agree with me because we've gone over this together, but just the idea is that I wish more people were more hopeful. I wish more people understood they need to encompass it. I think there's a lack of understanding of the technology, which makes people feel scared. Right. It's the fear of the unknown. So, I mean, I could sit here and talk about this all day, but I just think it's so important for us to encompass it. And I always say if you don't own the space, you get owned in the space. Right. So I think it's very important for us to own this space. Pharmacy is us. Absolutely. And again, going back to the upskilling part of it is we can't feel comfortable in just thinking that it's all about clinical pharmacy, but we have to think about how do we manage populations now, and what are the skills for the pharmacist in 2040, right? Because if we're talking about AI taking care of the vast majority of the patients, right, and then you need fewer pharmacists to take care of those really sick patients now,
what it then is the next generation pharmacist's role. And to me, it's managing the system and keeping track of the entire system. And that takes completely different skill set to be able to do that.
Absolutely. I see us more as liaisons. I see us as educators, like we should be.
Right.
The dispensing role is not what it's going to be. I mean, we have machines that have no back pain, no children at home,
right.
no, things on their mind. They're not standing up for 30 hours.
Right.
The idea is they have less to think about. And I think that, they have nothing to think about. They're a machine. They just have to do their task.
Right.
So they make less mistakes. I just see our role definitely being more of the person to come to as an all-inclusive of all their providers,
right.
and somebody to be able to help them understand it better. I see the face-to-face chats. We see the lines at pharmacies mostly being family members versus the patient at these days. And it's just, we need to get to our patients. We need to educate them. So I believe technology is going to help us out. But Doc, I truly appreciate you coming on the show today. I truly appreciate you coming down. Tomorrow we have Sandals Day. I hope you're excited.
Absolutely.
I'm excited. We got about 150 students signed up. But I can't wait to make this podcast go viral, make this video go viral. We just truly appreciate having you today. So this is another episode of PolitiTalkRx on the Pharmacy Podcast Network. And I want to thank everybody for listening in today. It's a very special day for us to have Dr. Lee on and talk about biosimilars. It is the future, and I hope more of you are educated. And if you want to hear any more information, where can they go visit so that they can hear some more information or get some more information about biosimilars?
There's a number of websites that I'll send you some links to, and you can link to that.
So we'll have them below, and we look forward to having you guys on the next show. Have a good one, guys.
Thank you for listening to PolitiTalkRx, part of the Pharmacy Podcast Network. If you're in the profession of pharmacy or if you're in the healthcare industry, you can't afford to sit idle and not be informed about your profession. We ask you to share these podcasts with your fellow pharmacy associates, your state and local government officials, and get involved in politics in some capacity, starting with being informed. We must take action, but only when we're educated and understand the issues and policies which lead us to a better tomorrow for our profession. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at PolitiTalkRx and send us an email at polititalkrx@gmail.com.